Welcome to this month's episode of Looking Back, Looking Forward. It's now late May 2020, and as of late May, we've now passed 5 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, and the highest single day of recorded infections so far. But in many ways, some parts of the world are now starting to move on to a next stage. If we think about the waves of the crisis, the first wave beginning in China, then throughout Asia, moving on to the Middle East, Europe, North America, and many of these we're now beginning to think forward about the implications. When we spoke in March we looked at preventing this crisis from becoming a financial crisis. And we looked at the essential necessity of focusing on liquidity and the means of payment. In April, we looked at the means of payment. We looked at electronic payment systems, and in particular, we looked at how this crisis, along with a range of geopolitical factors, is driving forward discussions of a technological transformation in monetary systems through central bank digital currencies and global stablecoins. This month, I want to begin looking forward. And I think the key here is to begin thinking about what are some of the implications of the very much ongoing crisis for the future of the global economy and the global financial system, and within that, the role of digital finance. And I think very much the starting point is that idea of liquidity versus solvency. And at the beginning, I think most of us hoped that this would be a short crisis and that things would quickly get back to how they were before. And under that scenario, what you simply need is sufficient liquidity, cash flows through the financial system to support people while things return to normal. But the longer a crisis lasts, the more the changes cease to be short-term bounce back, and more we become questions of longer-term structural changes. And certainly we use a framework, which is the idea of, is this crisis like 1919? 1919 coming out of the First World War, coming out of the Spanish flu, and very much as quickly as possible people wanted to get back to how things were before the war, before the pandemic. And that's something that we saw happen very quickly. Or is it 1929? 1929 is the beginning of a long-term structural change in the entire global economy and financial system, punctuated by the Second World War and bookended by the Cold War coming out of it. And so, as we think about this crisis, is it like 1919? Or is it more like 1929? And I think as we think about this issue, is it liquidity or is it solvency? Solvency means that structural changes impact on industries, which means that those industries, the way that they functioned is now fundamentally different. Many discussions going on about airlines, for instance. Airlines, if we had a 1919 moment, airlines come back very quickly. Global travel pops back. But it's looking less and less like that is going to be the situation. It's looking more and more like this crisis is going to cause structural changes to global travel, in particular if a vaccine or other sorts of management mechanisms are not developed quickly. And what that means is something that was a short-term liquidity crisis for airlines quickly becomes a structural change, becomes a solvency problem for those working in that industry. And I think if we look at this crisis from a structural standpoint, looking to digital finance, I think we can focus on those three big themes that we identified at the beginning of the series: technology, sustainability, and globalization versus fragmentation. Now, when we think about technology, one of the biggest impacts of this crisis so far has been to further drive a process of digitization, particularly in major economies. Digitization of monitoring systems, digitization of payments, digitization of commerce, digitization of food delivery, digitization of entertainment, digitization of every form of interaction. And many of those trends are not going away regardless of what happens with the crisis. The second has been an emergence of bigger and bigger players, that as we seek to have mechanisms whereby we can monitor an entire economy or provide support for communications or e-commerce or work from home systems across an entire country or region, the role of big tech firms becomes ever bigger. Now, of course, these processes of digitization, of big tech growing in scale and influence were taking place prior to this crisis as well. But very much the case that this crisis has accelerated those trends. Likewise, as we talked about in our last discussion, the idea of building financial infrastructure, of digital ID systems, of electronic payment systems, of central bank digital currencies, all forms of showing that technology, digital technology, digital finance is taking a far bigger role coming out of this crisis, and the players are growing ever bigger. And of course, that brings with it new risks from the tech standpoint, tech risks, cyber risks, etc., but it also brings real questions about future directions of sustainable development. Now, when we think about sustainability, I think the very first stage of this crisis is to realize that it is a sustainability crisis. It is a pandemic, and as we've highlighted before, this is only likely to be one of a number of such existential sustainability crises that we see over the coming decade. But this one, like many of those, is likely to have some of its most severe impact in developing countries, in poorer countries that have less access to some of the digitization, the big tech infrastructures that we've talked about as core means of supporting dealing with this crisis and supporting growth coming out. Likewise, travel is very much an industry that may well be permanently changed. Small businesses, this increasing dominance of big players means that from the standpoint of solvency, the first people who fail in a crisis are the small businesses. They have, by definition, less resources than the bigger players. And what tends to happen is that concentration increases coming out of a crisis like this. This, of course, was already a trend that we were seeing as a result of technological trends, digitization. And of course, when we think from the standpoint of future crises, is this crisis going to be the first of a series of crises which eventually, in sort of Jared Diamond formulation, takes down human civilization to a different level? Or is this crisis a practice? Is this something where we can use this crisis to build better systems which will enable us to respond better to the next crisis? Some of those systems being digital financial infrastructure to make economies and financial systems work better. But part of the answer to that question depends on what happens in the context of our third major trend, and that is globalization versus fragmentation. And certainly already this was a pre-existing trend of tensions in particular between the United States and China, with Europe, and between a wider range of countries. But coming out of this crisis, once again, it seems to be accelerating many of those trends. Trends towards relocation of manufacturing, towards scaling back global supply chains, towards greater self-sufficiency in food, technology, financial resources, as well as movement of people. And one aspect, as we discussed in the context of central bank digital currencies, is the idea of different major economies building electronic systems of money and payment to support their own economic and political areas. Now, we could easily see a fragmentation, or optimistically, we could see this and it's the alien test. The alien test, the aliens come to the Earth, and how do people react? Do they band together or do they split apart? And we're still waiting for the answer to that question in the context of this pandemic. It is still possible for different countries to come together to build a better solution, to put us in a better place for the next crisis. And central to that is building a better financial system. Now, next month, we'll talk a bit more about how this could happen.